Preparing for Airbus Cost Analyst interview questions and answers interview? You've reached Candy Mentor, and this video is for you. We'll walk through 25 key questions you're likely to face. For each question you'll see a sample answer followed by the key points to cover. Subscribe, like, and share, and drop a topic request in the comments. Question 1. What does a cost analyst do in an aerospace manufacturing environment? A cost analyst converts operational activity into financial insight. I would track actual costs against budgets, investigate variances, update forecasts, and explain implications to program managers, finance, procurement, and manufacturing teams. In aerospace, I would also consider long production cycles, engineering changes, supplier commitments, inventory, and certification requirements. My objective is not simply to report that costs changed, but to identify the driver, assess its future impact, and support a practical corrective decision. While answering, focus on budgeting, forecasting, cost tracking, variance analysis, operational partnering, reporting accuracy, and the importance of cost visibility across long development cycles, complex production programs, and highly regulated aerospace operations. Question 2. Why do you want to work as a cost analyst at Airbus? Airbus appeals to me because it combines advanced engineering with substantial financial and operational complexity. A cost analyst can influence decisions across design, procurement, production, and program management, rather than working only with historical numbers. I am particularly attracted to the long-term nature of aircraft programs, where disciplined forecasting and cost control create significant value. My analytical skills, attention to detail, and ability to communicate with non-finance stakeholders would help translate data into better program decisions. Make sure to cover Airbus's industrial scale, product complexity, long-term programs, international footprint, sustainability, analytical interest, and how your skills in finance and operations can improve cost transparency and decision-making. Question 3. How would you build a cost baseline for a new aircraft program? I would begin by defining the program scope and building a work breakdown structure aligned with engineering and manufacturing responsibilities. Then I would estimate material, direct labor, tooling, supplier, logistics, overhead, and development costs using the bill of materials, labor standards, schedules, and historical benchmarks. I would document assumptions, inflation, foreign exchange, risks, and contingency separately. After cross-functional challenge and approval, I would lock the baseline and establish change control procedures. In your answer, talk about scope definition, work breakdown structure, bill of materials, labor assumptions, supplier estimates, overhead rates, schedule, risk allowances, escalation, approvals, and version control for the approved baseline. Question 4. What is the difference between fixed, variable, direct, and indirect costs? Fixed and variable describe how a cost changes with activity, while direct and indirect describe whether it can be traced economically to a product or program. Aircraft materials are usually direct and variable, while factory rent is indirect and fixed. Assembly labor may be direct but partly fixed if staffing is committed. Tooling can be direct to a program, although its accounting treatment may differ. Distinguishing these categories improves forecasting, allocation, and decision analysis. Be sure to mention that fixed versus variable describes behavior, while direct versus indirect describes traceability, and explain aerospace examples such as materials, assembly labor, factory rent, tooling, and production overhead. Question 5. How would you analyze an unfavorable manufacturing cost variance? I would first confirm that the variance is real by reconciling actual postings, production volumes, and reporting periods. Next, I would decompose it into material price, material usage, labor rate, labor efficiency, volume, mix, overhead absorption, and one-time items. I would speak with production and procurement to identify the operational cause, quantify whether it is temporary or recurring, and update the forecast. Finally, I would assign actions and monitor whether the variance closes. Focus on decomposing the variance into price, usage, labor rate, efficiency, volume, mix, overhead absorption, timing, and one-off effects. then validating data and agreeing corrective actions with operations. Question 6. Explain standard costing and how you would maintain reliable standards. Standard costing assigns expected material, labor, and overhead costs to a product using approved prices, quantities, routings, and rates. I would maintain reliability by reviewing standards after supplier negotiations, engineering changes, productivity improvements, labor rate updates, and significant market movements. Changes should be supported by evidence, approved through governance, and dated clearly. I would also compare standards with actual performance, because recurring variances may indicate that the standard itself no longer reflects operating reality. Mention predetermined material, labor, and overhead rates, periodic updates, engineering changes, supplier price movements, routing accuracy, governance, variance interpretation, and avoiding standards that are either outdated or overly optimistic. Question 7. How would you use earned value management to assess an aircraft program? Earned value management compares the value of work planned, the value actually completed, and the cost incurred. I would monitor planned value, earned value, and actual cost, then calculate schedule performance and cost performance indicators. A cost performance index below 1 suggests the program is spending more than the value delivered. I would investigate the work packages behind the result, validate progress measurement, and use the evidence to improve the estimate at completion. In your answer, cover planned value, earned value, actual cost, schedule performance index, cost performance index, work package discipline, forecast completion, and limitations when progress measurement is subjective. Question 8. How do you calculate and interpret estimate at completion? Estimate at completion represents the expected total cost when the program finishes. I would calculate it as actual cost to date plus a credible estimate to complete, supported by remaining labor, materials, suppliers, schedule, risks, and engineering changes. I could also use trend-based formulas as a reasonableness check, but not blindly. I would reconcile the bottom-up forecast with performance indicators, explain the assumptions, and highlight risks that could move the final outcome. Be sure to explain the approved budget, actual cost, estimate to complete, independent analytical formulas, remaining risk, management judgment, and reconciliation between bottom-up and trend-based forecasts. Question 9. How would you allocate indirect costs across aircraft programs? I would select an allocation base that reflects how the indirect cost is consumed. Factory support might use direct labor hours, machine-related costs could use machine hours, and shared services might use headcount or transaction volumes. I would apply the method consistently and document the rationale under company policy. I would also review whether the allocation distorts decisions, particularly when program volumes, automation, or production footprints change significantly. Focus on causality, consistent allocation bases, labor hours, machine hours, headcount, activity drivers, approved policies, operational fairness, and testing whether allocations distort program profitability or decision-making. Question 10. What is the difference between a budget, forecast, and actual cost? The budget is the approved financial plan for a defined period or program baseline. Actual cost is what has been recorded through the accounting system. The forecast is the latest estimate of what will happen, incorporating current performance, known changes, and emerging risks. I would compare actuals with budget to explain performance, then update the forecast when assumptions change. Keeping these views separate prevents historical results from being confused with future expectations. Make sure to distinguish the approved plan, the latest expectation, and recorded performance, while explaining how analysts reconcile them and use each view for accountability, decision-making, and forward-looking control. Question 11. How would you assess a make versus buy decision for an aircraft component? I would compare the supplier quote with the relevant internal costs, separating avoidable costs from allocated costs that would remain after outsourcing. I would include tooling, logistics, quality assurance, transition, inventory, warranty, and capacity implications. Financially, I would test the decision across volume, inflation, exchange rates, and supplier risk scenarios. I would then present strategic factors such as intellectual property, capability retention, delivery reliability, and quality, because the lowest quoted unit cost may not be the best total decision. Discuss relevant incremental costs, avoidable fixed costs, supplier pricing, capacity, quality, lead time, intellectual property, strategic capability, transition costs, and sensitivity analysis rather than relying only on unit cost. Question 12. How would you investigate a sudden increase in supplier costs? I would reconcile the increase to purchase orders, invoices, receipts, quantities, and part numbers before concluding that the supplier raised prices. I would separate unit price changes from volume, product mix, freight, expedite fees, currency, and engineering change effects. I would review contractual escalation clauses and discuss the driver with procurement and the supplier. Finally, I would quantify the current and forecast impact, challenge unsupported charges, and reflect any confirmed change in the cost outlook. Cover invoice validation, price changes, purchase order terms, quantity and mix, foreign exchange, expedite charges, engineering changes, commodity exposure, supplier communication, and whether the impact is recurring or one-off. Question 13. How do engineering changes affect cost analysis? An engineering change can affect material specifications, supplier prices, tooling, labor hours, inventory, rework, testing, and delivery timing. I would first confirm the approved change and identify every affected work package, purchase order, and inventory balance. Then I would estimate one-time implementation costs and recurring unit cost effects, document assumptions, and update the forecast through formal change control. Maintaining a clear bridge from the original baseline protects accountability and prevents double counting. Mention design revisions, obsolete inventory, rework, tooling, supplier amendments, labor and schedule effects, approval workflows, configuration control, and updating cost estimates without losing traceability to the original baseline. Question 14. What cost drivers are most important in aircraft manufacturing? The major drivers usually include high-value materials, supplier pricing and delivery, direct labor productivity, production volume, tooling, quality and rework, engineering changes, logistics, and factory overhead. Program timing also matters because delays can extend labor, facilities, financing, and support costs. I would connect each driver to measurable indicators, such as hours per unit, scrap rates, supplier variance, and schedule milestones. That approach turns a broad cost problem into manageable operational levers. In your answer, identify materials, labor productivity, supplier performance, production volume, industrialization, tooling, quality, rework, schedule, configuration changes, inflation, and foreign exchange, linking each driver to measurable indicators. Question 15. How would you build a labor cost forecast for a production line? I would start with the production schedule and estimate labor hours by work package, skill category, and unit. I would apply approved labor rates, then layer in learning curve improvements, staffing levels, overtime, shift premiums, wage inflation, absenteeism, and planned productivity initiatives. I would reconcile the forecast to headcount capacity and the industrial plan. If actual hours per unit deteriorated, I would separate volume effects from efficiency issues before changing the underlying assumptions. Discuss headcount, labor hours per unit, production rate, learning curves, overtime, wage inflation, absenteeism, skill mix, shift patterns, productivity initiatives, and reconciliation to the manufacturing schedule. Question 16. How would you treat inventory and work in progress in a cost analysis? I would understand how materials, labor, and overhead flow into raw materials, work in progress, and finished goods, then reconcile operational quantities to the general ledger. I would investigate unusual WIP growth, aged balances, excess inventory, obsolescence, rework, and differences between standard and actual cost. I would also confirm that inventory reflects the correct configuration and production status. Accurate inventory analysis matters because timing a cost in WIP versus expense can materially change reported program performance. Cover inventory valuation, standard versus actual cost, WIP accumulation, material usage, completed units, obsolescence, excess quantities, rework, production status, and reconciliation between operational records and the general ledger. Question 17. How would you use Excel or data tools to improve cost reporting? I would use Excel for controlled analysis, combining clean source data with Power Query, pivot tables, lookup formulas, and reconciliation checks. I would automate repetitive transformations, document assumptions, protect formulas, and maintain version control. For recurring reporting, I would build dashboards showing budget, actual, forecast, variance, and key drivers. I would never let automation replace review. Totals must tie to the source system, unusual movements need investigation, and critical outputs require independent checks. Be sure to mention structured data, Power Query, pivot tables, formulas, validation checks, automation, version control, audit trails, dashboarding, and knowing when a spreadsheet should be replaced by a controlled system. Question 18. How do you ensure data quality when working with ERP cost data? I would establish checks at the source, including valid cost centers, work orders, material numbers, dates, currencies, and supplier references. I would reconcile extracted data to the general ledger and investigate duplicates, missing postings, unusual manual journals, late receipts, and interface failures. I would document data lineage and validation results so another analyst can reproduce the report. If an issue remained unresolved, I would quantify its impact, disclose the limitation, and escalate it promptly. Focus on master data, cost centers, work orders, purchase orders, period cutoff, duplicate postings, interfaces, reconciliations, exception reports, documentation, and escalation of unresolved discrepancies. Question 19. How would you explain a complex cost variance to a non-finance manager? I would lead with the business message, not accounting terminology. For example, I might say that the program is over plan because each unit requires 8 additional labor hours, caused by a recurring assembly issue. I would show a simple bridge from budget to actual, distinguish confirmed facts from estimates, and explain the forecast consequence. I would then agree an operational action, owner, and follow-up date, ensuring the discussion ends with decisions rather than merely information. Mention starting with the business impact, using plain language, separating facts from assumptions, showing driver-based bridges, avoiding accounting jargon, agreeing actions, and confirming the manager understands the message. Question 20. Tell me about a time you found a cost reporting error. In a previous reporting cycle, I noticed that labor cost per unit had increased sharply while production volume was stable. I reconciled the report to the ledger and found that one work order had been mapped to the wrong cost center. I quantified the effect, corrected the mapping with the accounting team, and reissued the analysis before the management meeting. I also added an exception check comparing work order ownership with prior periods, reducing the chance of recurrence. Use a concise star structure, explaining the control or analytical signal, investigation, quantified impact, correction, stakeholder communication, and preventive improvement without blaming another team. Question 21. How would you handle conflicting cost estimates from finance, engineering, and procurement? I would first determine whether the estimates cover the same scope, timing, configuration, currency, and cost categories. Many disagreements reflect different assumptions rather than poor analysis. I would create a reconciliation showing labor, materials, suppliers, overhead, risks, and exclusions, then ask each function to validate its inputs. I would use historical evidence and approved technical information to challenge assumptions constructively. The final estimate should document ownership, assumptions, and unresolved risks for management approval. Cover aligning scope and assumptions, identifying timing and definition differences, using evidence, reconciling bottom-up estimates, facilitating challenge, documenting decisions, and escalating only after attempting structured resolution. Question 22. How would you perform sensitivity analysis on a program forecast? I would identify the assumptions most capable of changing the result, such as production rate, labor hours per unit, supplier prices, exchange rates, inflation, and schedule. I would model base, upside, and downside cases, first isolating individual drivers and then testing correlated combinations. I would quantify the effect on total cost and key milestones, assign probabilities where appropriate, and explain management triggers. Sensitivity analysis is most useful when it leads to actions, not just wider ranges. Discuss selecting material drivers, defining realistic upside and downside cases, changing one variable at a time and in combinations, quantifying impact, probability, management actions, and communicating decision thresholds. Question 23. What controls would you expect in a robust cost analysis process? A robust process should include approved budgets, controlled master data, appropriate system access, segregation of preparation and review, reconciliations to the ledger, and documented variance explanations. Forecast changes should have clear ownership, supporting evidence, and an audit trail. I would also check period cutoff, unusual journals, interface completeness, and sign off before distribution. These controls provide reliable information while preserving traceability from an individual transaction through the program report and management decision. Be sure to mention segregation of duties, approved baselines, access controls, reconciliations, change logs, review evidence, period cutoff, forecast sign-off, data retention, and auditability from source transaction to management report. Question 24. How would you prioritize work during a month-end close with urgent management requests? I would map requests by deadline, materiality, decision impact, and dependency on close data. I would complete controls critical close activities first, then provide management with a clearly labeled preliminary view if a decision could not wait. I would clarify scope, agree realistic delivery times, and communicate trade-offs early rather than silently sacrificing quality. Where possible, I would reuse validated data and delegate defined tasks, while retaining review responsibility for the final output. Focus on deadlines, materiality, business impact, dependencies, minimum viable analysis, communication, delegation, quality controls, and protecting close accuracy while providing clearly labeled preliminary information when necessary. Question 25. What would you do if a program is forecast to exceed its cost target? I would first validate the forecast and separate committed costs, remaining work, risks, and potential accounting timing effects. Next, I would identify the largest root causes, such as productivity, supplier pricing, rework, schedule delay, or configuration change. I would develop quantified recovery options with engineering, operations, procurement, and program leadership, testing their cost, timing, quality, and delivery consequences. I would communicate the gap early, update the estimate transparently, and track approved actions until closure. In your answer, cover validating the forecast, separating committed from estimated costs, identifying root causes, quantifying recovery options, assessing risks, engaging stakeholders, updating governance, and avoiding unsupported cost reductions. If you are still with us, congratulations, you are much ahead of the rest and serious about preparing for your interview. We hope we were able to add value to your preparation and create some helpful content. Do not forget to like and share this video. Your small act can do great things for us.